All right. So we're back for season 2 of Terrible Parables.
Yes, we are.
Season 2. They brought us back. Can you believe it?
I know, whether you wanted it or not, they brought us back, I suppose.
Yeah, mostly I just hope this isn't like a season 2 of Friday Night Lights situation.
I don't get that reference.
So season 1 was amazing. And
Okay.
season 2, they like tried to spice it up and like
Make it sexier, more drama.
More drama, and
Yeah.
it just made it way worse.
Okay.
It was very bad.
Like one of the characters killed a guy and like got away with it.
Buried the
Okay.
body and they got away with it. It's You can skip that whole season, by the way, if you don't care about,
Just pretend it never happened.
just go right to season 3.
But now that you said that, it kind of made us seem like self-aware about that. So maybe that will...
I mean, you're the anxious Christian, so of course.
yeah,
That's how
I'm
it
an
works.
anxious person in general. This is Terrible Parables, a podcast of Mockingbird Ministries, in which a Bible scholar, a pastor, and an anxious Christian look for some good news and passages of Scripture that are difficult, frightening, or particularly, well, terrible. I'm your host, Callie Yee, and in a little bit, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Todd Brewer and Brian Jarrell. Join us as we find that sometimes the spooky things that go bump in the night are just figments of our imaginations. From Matthew 22. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away. One to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets, and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" I would just like to start off by saying that this is, I think, one of the first times I've ever actually read this parable.
Like just now.
Well, no, not just now, but in prepping for Terrible Parables. It was one of the first times that I read it. And at first, as I was going through, I was like, oh, like, that's cool. Like, everyone is invited, like both good and bad people, eventually to the wedding banquet. I was like, that's great news. That follows what I know about Jesus, like the lost, the lonely, the suffering. And then we get to the end of the parable, and the guy who wasn't dressed properly is like kicked out. Not only that, but like cast into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then I was like, well, that's actually terrifying. Yeah, I was like,
What a twist.
a complete 180. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this. So tell me more. Why is it terrible? Besides just the weeping and gnashing of teeth, I suppose.
Can I tell a fun fact about this parable first?
Yeah.
So one of the fun facts about this parable is this parable and some of the research I was sort of doing about this parable is where the title of this podcast came from.
Okay.
Oh.
Because I was looking up Luther and what Luther had to say about this parable in due course for like PhD studies. And Luther says, this is from 1531, he said, "This gospel is not difficult," i.e. like hard,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a terrible gospel.
Oh.
About this parable. I said, oh,
Yeah.
so a terrible parable.
A
All
terrible
right,
parable.
there you go.
Wow.
But
Well, like you were saying, Callie, like it's the terrible part of the parable is unique to Matthew, and it's that little tag at the end about the guy who's not there dressed right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a version of this in Luke's gospel, and it just ends after the new guests get invited. So
Oh.
you have this parable, right? And then Matthew tags on this little extra bit at the end, and it's that part that makes it harder to understand because, you know, what do you make of this guy who shows up without the wedding clothes and gets kicked out?
listen to Brian like imbibing the Q hypothesis informed criticism. This is interesting.
Yes, well,
Matthew added, did he?
yes.
So I mean, I would actually reverse it and say
Or Luke subtracted it, maybe.
Luke is reading Matthew and he's like, I don't know what the heck to do with this part. And he's like,
But that's kind of like the other guy who likes Luke but doesn't like Matthew. What's his name? We talked about him in
Marcion?
Yeah.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right.
It makes me think of him.
well,
He would agree with Luke.
Yeah, he would agree with Luke. Luke reads the bit about the guy with without the clothes, and he's like, I like this first point. I'm gonna stick with this one. That's really what Jesus was actually trying to say with this parable.
At the very least, we can say that Matthew has this extra part here. And that's where I think the main focus of why the parable is so terrible, right? Like we get the other stuff in terms of being invited to a wedding and then turning down the invite. And the guy's like, oh, well, that's rude and stinks. I'm going to go find other people. It's like, okay, well, that's not exactly terrible. But the flip side of this is, you know, this guy ends up like weeping and gnashing of teeth, like you said. And from what is it exactly about the situation that lends to such anger and frustration from the king? I think that's really the question at hand that makes it so terrible to go through.
Is it because he's not dressed appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally because he's not
It's
dressed
literally-
appropriately.
Would you
Right.
say I'm dressed appropriately? I have holes in my shirt.
Borderline?
Borderline.
It
Are you going to
depends.
kick me out? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. I actually wore this shirt specifically for this episode.
Would you like to tell everybody about your shirt? Because you have told us about the shirt, and it is a fun shirt. Tell everybody about your shirt.
My shirt has a David Bowie reference on it, but I bought it I bought it with the holes in it.
You bought it with the holes.
It wasn't secondhand?
No, it wasn't secondhand.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't create the holes by wearing it so much. The holes were there when I bought it. I bought it
Aha.
with holes.
Distressed
So,
clothing.
yeah.
Pre-distressed.
Yeah, my parents would be ashamed. But alas,
Yeah.
this is what I can do with my adult money.
So I think part of why people think that this is so terrible is we don't tend to think much of clothing in the same way that they did. And so when the king kicks out the guy with the clothing, it seems a little ticky tacky, right?
Yeah.
Like he didn't get the dress code, right? As if this guy showed up to a restaurant, went to the maitre d', and the maitre d' said, "Why don't you have a jacket on?" and kicked him out.
Like it doesn't seem like a terrible offense to us.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like
Yeah.
that big of a deal,
Yeah.
right? Like, okay, he wore a polo shirt instead of or whatever. So that's one reason. But the other is that the image of the parable of the sort of invitations is that it seems to be coming fairly quickly. In other words, these are people who are dragged in from the street, and how could he have the right clothes if he just came from where he was working? Like it seems like it's blaming him for something that isn't really his fault. How could he, how is he wearing the wrong clothes? He just came from work,
Yeah, and I think the other piece of this too, right? It's a parable, and so our inclination is try to put ourselves in the parable. Where are we as the readers in the parable?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the anxiety, and if you hear this passage, teaching or preached upon, if people focus on the guy without the right clothes, there is a question here of like, well, what does that mean? Like spiritually, what does it mean devotionally for the Christian to wear the right clothes?
Right.
Yeah.
And so then again, I've talked about this on the season 1, this moralism vacuum, right? We can just sort of say, well, wearing the right clothes means, X, Y, Z, A, B, C. It can mean whatever we want it to mean. And we just project our favorite moralisms in there.
Right.
And there is a sense in which when you read this parable, like you want to know, okay, well, if this is going to apply to my life, does this mean that I'm not wearing the right clothes? And then I'm in the wedding, but I'm getting kicked out? Does that mean like I'm a Christian, but I'm kicked out of the kingdom of God because my clothes aren't right or something?
I mean,
like
that's
that?
how I read it when I first,
Now,
since it's new to me. Yeah.
Brian, you seem like the kind of guy who at least once in his life has shown up to something wearing the wrong clothes.
Oh, absolutely. More than
Like
one time.
wildly underdressed.
Wildly underdressed. I mean, part of it's just because clothes are the last things I care about. So I don't really have a lot of nice clothes.
Yeah.
But I do remember one particular wedding in college. And this is, right, you go to college if you are a college person. And like right after college, everyone's getting married. At least that's how it was in my world.
Spring by spring.
And, and so there was that first slew of weddings. And like I was sort of torn jeans, flip-flops, kind of guy in college. And so I remember one wedding in particular where I did show up. And, I put on like a sweater and no tie, but looked okay. But I had some ratty jeans and flip-flops and I went to this wedding.
You wore flip-flops to a wedding?
Oh, yeah. And I was very underdressed. And I looked around and I said, missed this one, like misread this one completely. And I've gotten better.
Yeah.
But I've gotten better about it. But
Yeah. And if they had kicked you out because you were wearing flip-flops, you would never speak to them again.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right.
Like they were just happy I was there. And I think every wedding needs at least one or two people who are like completely different. My experience has been anyway.
There always needs one Hawaiian shirt.
Yeah. Like
Keeps
the
things
Hawaiian
interesting.
shirt guy or the, somebody to be a little different.
Yeah. I mean, so the theologically, this passage is for many a very sort of direct justification of the third use of the law, right?
What is the third use of the law?
I shall explain. So the idea that you're in by grace, right? The good and the bad, all brought in, and you maintain your status as one who is saved by good works. And therefore, i.e., you need the right clothes. So, and it's like right there. It's like good news, and then it's you're not measuring, but you're not measuring up. And I think a lot of us have been to churches where that is our experience, where coming in the door, the wedding banquet is for you. And then you get there, you sit down, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with a list of shoulds of how to fit in.
And some of those shoulds involve a dress code, right?
And oftentimes those
Yes.
shoulds involve dress codes.
That's
blue
kind of unsaid,
blazers,
but-
khakis, attractive but not immodest, pearls maybe. Anyway, it can include that, but usually it's more than that. It's sort of habits, attitudes, behaviors, and sometimes political opinions. Sometimes it's devotional practices. I mean, it can be any number of things that become
marital status.
Yeah, marital
Ensuring
status.
you join a small group, devotional, that sort of thing.
And so this does have that moralism vacuum, right? Like you get in by grace, but then here's what you have to do to stay in. And I think, the more time we spend with this passage, the less that will become apparent.
Okay. So, what is the good news about this parable? What makes it not so terrible?
Before Brian jumps in, I want to say one thing, which is one solution that is often given. That is a bad solution.
Okay.
So one solution that's often given is the supposition that wedding guests were provided clothing when they got to the wedding. There's like no evidence, or very next to no evidence, that this was that practice was at all happening.
And then if they were provided clothing, why wouldn't the guy take the clothing?
So that's the rub. It's like, he was given everything he needed, and he still insisted on wearing his own stuff. So that's
kind of how they're dealing with the
right. So the king is benevolent because he's providing the thing he requires the guy to wear. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it is, and so you get from that to then like clothed in Christ and the righteousness of Christ.
Yes.
Yeah. And the wedding garment is Christ's righteousness. So here's a guy who's not wearing Christ's righteousness. Of course, he's going to be cast out.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So that's often where how some people try to provide a solution to this is they create this fictive first century practice that explains everything. It's the camel's gate example, right?
Yeah.
How does a camel fit through the eye of a needle? Well, there was a gate in Jerusalem that was called the Needle's Eye, and camels could only get through. Yeah,
if they knelt and crawled through.
So rich men can be saved if they kneel, i.e., if they're humble. Right. So you invent this kind of
that's all fictitious. Practice. None of that is true. There's no evidence any of that is true at all.
Yeah.
I think when I look at this, the interpretive context here is there's the in and the out, like who's there, who's out, right? And let's make sure we get the beginning of the parable down before we get the end, right? Weddings in the ancient Near East were a big stinking deal, right? Like parties, banquets. And again, the text says explicitly this is a wedding feast. And so you have this wedding feast. Oftentimes, these were parties that lasted for a week. And these were parties with lots of food. And so oftentimes these ceremonies, these wedding parties and receptions were the highlight of the social calendar in any given year. So the idea that you would turn down the king's wedding banquet is so absurd in this text, and for very silly reasons, right? Why do they say they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm and another to his business, and then others seized the servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. I mean, that's absurd that, like, hey, come to the biggest party of the year. The king's getting married. It's going to be a good time. Or the prince is getting married or whatever.
What voice is that?
It's Kermit the Frog and Larry the Cucumber. All right. But the idea here is like these people are out, right? And whenever the servants are this is another thing too. Whenever the servants are seized and treated shamefully and killed, Jesus uses that language to talk about the prophets. It's a link towards the prophets. Anyway, and so then what ends up happening is, okay, well, new people get invited. There's a lot of honor and shame pieces here about the king inviting people and rejecting, and the king being shamed by people who would rather do their farm work or their business work than come to his party. Like there's insults being leveled. There's the insanity of rejecting the party at the outright when that was something that you just didn't do in that time. So I think part of this is weddings are so important. The parties are so important. There's honor and shame things that when the guy shows up improperly dressed for this wedding, whatever I think we'll get into more about what that means. It's shameful to the king.
But my question about that is, there are a lot of times where we do like dishonor God, and there's a lot of shame in that, but we're not like cast out, or there's no weeping and gnashing of teeth. So how do we like reconcile our understanding of that God with what the parable is talking about?
So I think it's important. I wrote a whole book about this, by the way. When reading and interpreting parables, it's within a narrative context. It's important to have that narrative context inform what the parable is saying. Right. Okay. So you have a story within a broader story and have those mutually interpret one another. So this isn't a one-off saying. This is a narrative within a narrative. Right. Okay. Right. I wrote a whole book about it. It's titled Hermeneutics in Early Christian Gospels. It's ridiculously expensive. This is the only plug you will ever hear from me on this podcast. Buy it.
Congratulations on the book, though. Seriously, Todd.
Thank you. So, so in that book, I did a lot of work on the previous parable, which is the parable of the tenants. So one of the interesting things about this parable happening right after the parable of the tenants is that the parable of the tenants is essentially a salvation history in a nutshell. Right. So for that parable, the sending out of servants, again, which is what happens here, parallels the sending of the prophets to Israel, and the treatment
That's like what you were saying, Brian.
and the treatment of those servants. But here's the thing: where most interpreters go wrong is then when it gets to the party itself, they shift the time frame from the ministry of Jesus to the future church. And that's the wrong move to make. In the same way, the previous parable ends with the rejection of the son and the cornerstone becoming the rejected stone becoming the chief cornerstone as a reference to Jesus's ministry. The context for this parable is the same, namely the context of Jesus's ministry. So when you do that, you're left with two different options for who the person without the right wedding garment is. Either it's the Pharisees and the scribes who he's talking to, or it's Judas. So if it's the Pharisees and the scribes, they're the ones who are part of Jesus's ministry. He's legit trying to appeal to them.
He does,
right? And they're a part of the many, but they are not part of the few. So that's one possibility. The second of Judas, I think, is interesting because for a number of reasons. The first, the connection to Judas can be established by the calling the man of his friend. So, friend, he says, how did you enter without a wedding garment?
Yeah.
I actually didn't even notice the word friend in there.
Yeah. So the friend is a very rare word in the New Testament. It only happens 3 times. It happens all in Matthew's gospel, and it's probably better translated as like comrade.
Okay.
And in Matthew's gospel, it's spoken to someone who is a sort of an opponent of Jesus. And the first time it happens is in the parable of the
workers getting their paycheck.
The workers in the vineyard.
Yeah, workers in the vineyard.
Where the landowner says to those who are grumbling about not getting the right amount of money, and he says, "Friend," it's an appeal to an adversary. It happens then here, and the third time it happens is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas has shown up to betray Jesus, and Jesus says, "Friend, do what you are here for."
Right.
And so what you can sort of imagine then is that this isn't about the second coming and the final judgment and the fate of all Christians.
Okay.
This is about those within Jesus's immediate ministry and to what degree they are responding and accepting or rejecting him.
Okay.
So it sidelines the entire kind of
eschatology question.
Yeah.
There's other passages in Matthew that are about eschatology.
Yes, but this one is about Jesus' ministry.
But this one, because the previous parable, the parable of the tenants, is not about eschatology.
Okay.
So, and that is true, and it's also then true of 22.
Yeah.
So it's not about eschatology. It's about those who are responding to Jesus's ministry, his call versus those who are chosen. Many are called, few are chosen. That phrase sits oddly within the world of the parable, but it makes perfect sense to Jesus' ministry. So if you want to say that this is about the second coming and the last judgment, then you're really at a stretch to do so. I mean, the closest way you get there is to say that the way of the judgment vis-a-vis Jesus' ministry and those who reject him is then prefigures the judgment at the second coming.
Right.
But then that changes the criteria. That says that the criteria is how you respond to Jesus in his ministry,
Mm-hmm.
not some moral checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it makes sense with Judas, right? Because you have, in some sense, right, the many are called, few are chosen. You have, let's just say, for example, the 12 disciples, right? You
Well,
have
there
the
were there were more than 12.
And there's more. There's at least
Yeah.
70 more. Like there's this massive group of disciples following him, right?
Yeah.
Like they're called, theoretically, they're chosen. They're following him in his ministry. And in the midst, there's one guy, and we know he's the betrayer. And Jesus says he's like a wedding crasher. He's there without the clothes on. And that's not to say that Judas is somehow, it's to say that Jesus sees something in Judas where whatever the teachings of the gospel is, like he's there, he's listening, he's hearing them, and then but he's not getting it, and he's actually eventually going to reject it. He's going to say, actually, it's not just that I don't get it, it's that I don't like it, and that's part of what inspires his betrayal. And so you have someone who is like the people who are, they've rejected the invitation. He's someone who's close by. He's right in the middle of it too, but he's also rejected the invitation.
Yeah.
And this is a sort of metaphorical way of talking about that.
So it's not about people who want to be invited to the party and remain there. It's about people who have rejected the invitation.
Well, yeah, and to put a finer point on the rejecting of the invitation. So the point about the parable of the workers in the vineyard is that they are begrudging the owner's generosity.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that is precisely what happens immediately before when Judas betrays Jesus. It's this waste of money and an outpouring of generosity for the sake of Jesus.
It's
And
the woman-
Judas is angry about it.
Right. It's the woman who breaks the perfume and washes Jesus' hair with her feet.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Judas's big bugaboo about that is like, we could have sold that and give it to the poor.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, no, you don't understand. Like, this is appropriate abundance for what is coming, and what she understands more than anybody else in the room right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the event that really sets Judas off to go talk about betrayal in that moment.
Yeah. So Judas's difficulty is he begrudges generosity. He is kind of miserly with money, and the depiction of Judas evolves and sort of grows. And John has a more, which is where we often think of when we think of Judas. John's gospel has Judas sort of overtaken by Satan, and so you have greater overtones. But the association between Judas and money is a strong one. It's both in Mark's gospel and then repeated in here, and perhaps then tied back to the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Workers who are begrudging the generosity of the vineyard owner.
Yeah.
Right.
And in that way, the parable of the here in the wedding banquet and the guy who isn't part of the party, so to speak, could be what is he objecting to? Maybe he's objecting to the benevolence of the king, and showing his displeasure by wearing different clothes.
Yeah, he's spending all this money on people who don't deserve it, right? The people going to and fro on the streets, right? In that sense, it's almost a waste of money to invite all these strangers into the banquet. And so,
It also explains why the man who in the parable doesn't respond to the accusation. He had nothing to say.
right.
That language then parallels the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus addresses Judas.
Yeah.
Friend, do what you would do here.
Yeah.
Judas doesn't say anything.
Yeah. I'm interested by the use of the word friend. Like,
Isn't that interesting?
yeah, because usually friend is a good thing. And here it feels like it's being used as like.
Well, I don't think it's ironic. I think, I think this person is a friend, right? Judas, whether it's Judas or whether it's the scribes and the Pharisees.
There's almost an extension of charity in that, right? Like they may not agree on everything, but they're going to work through their, it's a way of addressing the person without actually condemning the person.
Yeah.
I mean, I do this sometimes too. Like if I'm in conflict with someone, like I will use that in term like that kind of language to bring down the tone of the argument, So, I was recently out at a restaurant and they served the wrong thing at the restaurant. and they said they were going to take the thing off the bill. It was a salad or something. And when they brought the bill, the salad was still on there. So like, how do you have the conflict to be like, we said the salad wasn't going to be on there, and you could be very polite about it. You can say you're having conflict, but you can be polite about it at the same time.
I would not be polite about that. I would try very hard, but I'm not good at faking or withholding my animosity. So, but friend, you would say like, hi friend.
Yeah. Friend, real quick, just a second.
Hey friend.
Yeah.
It feels like Southern passive aggression. Hi friend.
Or Minnesotan passive aggression.
It does kind of feel like a little passive aggressiveness here, doesn't it?
Bless your heart.
Yeah.
It's like, but we're going to have conflict, but I want to respect you and kind of bring the tone down. So, use nice language.
But I think the association between this friend and Judas and or the scribes and the Pharisees puts a different point on the parable than someone who is not cutting out,
just making
the grade in their Christian good works.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is what I think of. Like when I first read this parable, I was thinking of the end times, like of eschatology.
Right.
Like that's what my brain went to immediately. And so to hear that it is referencing Jesus' ministry of who he's talking about, talking to the Pharisees or to Judas, like that feels like good news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's not universalism, but it's certainly good news.
Yes. All right. So my article, I think, points to the anxiety that this parable produces. It's about imposter syndrome. And
I've never suffered from imposter syndrome. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's called Why Everyone Feels Like They're Faking It, and it's by Leslie Jameson for The New Yorker. If we reclaim the imposter phenomenon from the false category of syndrome, then we can allow it to do the work it does best, which is to depict a particular texture of interior experience, the fear of being exposed as inadequate. As a concept, it is most useful in its particular nuances, not as a vague synonym for insecurity or self-doubt, but as a way to describe the more specific delusion of being a fraud who has successfully deceived some external audience. Understood like this, it becomes an experience not diluted, but defined by its ubiquity. It names the gap that persists between the internal experiences of selfhood, multiple, contradictory, incoherent, striated with shame and desire, and the imperative to present a more coherent, composed, continuous self to the world. When I spoke to Stephanie Land, the best-selling author of Made, her memoir about cleaning houses to support herself as a single mother, she described her own imposter feelings as an experience of class whiplash, occupying spaces of privilege after she'd grown famous for writing about economic hardship. When she flew first class with her teenage daughter to see a Lizzo concert and a stranger thanked her for her writing, Land felt that she'd been caught somewhere she didn't belong. As if flying first class made her current self a fraud, or else her past self a fraud, or somehow both versions of her were fraudulent at once. Land's observations helped me realize that the imposter phenomenon as a concept effectively functions as an emotional filing cabinet organizing a variety of fraught feelings that we can experience as we try to reconcile three aspects of our personhood: how we experience ourselves, how we present ourselves to the world, and how the world reflects that self back to us. The phenomenon names an unspoken, ongoing crisis arising from the gaps between these various versions of the self, and designates not a syndrome, but an inescapable part of being alive.
That's good.
Yeah, feels like a mic drop, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's funny. I don't know a single pastor of any sort who doesn't, well, let me rephrase this. I don't know a healthy, wise minister of the gospel who doesn't have this imposter syndrome at the heart of what they do. That sense of sort of not being good enough, not being strong enough, or if my congregation only knew what was going on my insides, or they only knew how I yelled at my kid the other night, or if they only knew, the financial situation that we have, or if they only knew the feelings I really had to my mother, like those kind of things, we hide them away. And so that sense of, I really hope I don't get found out, right? I just think that it's such a widespread experience, this imposter syndrome, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because this parable, if you don't understand what it's really about, like feels like imposter syndrome, because it feels like
a sanctioning of judgment of those who are imposters.
Right. That the guy showing up without the right clothes is an imposter, and if we're that same way, then out we go. And that's why I think it's a good fit for what we're talking about with this parable.
Yeah, I will say, as an aside, Brian, there's a difference if kind, not just degree, between pastors who feel like an imposter because they were angry with their child the night before, and pastors who feel like imposters because they're hiding lots of secrets.
That's true.
So
I
think we
they're hiding the adulterous
not every
affair,
secret is created the same.
That's true.
But yeah, so in PhD studies, everyone felt like imposters there. And those who didn't feel like imposters either never let on that they were feeling that way, or they were supremely self-confident in a way that rubbed most people the wrong way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it takes a while to achieve something and somehow feel like you're worthy of what you've actually achieved, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I hang out with college kids on Monday nights, and they're great. They're so much cooler than I am. But I sometimes feel like an imposter there, because my professor who leads the group, he really loves the work that I'm doing and all of that. And so that's how I got connected with the group. But sometimes I have to lead discussion, and I'm worried they're going to find out that I'm really not great with words, or I'm really not great at leading discussion. But I find that when I talk to them about those insecurities, or when I'm yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, but we'll figure it out. That's how it is. When I'm honest with them about it, I feel like we can come to some level of, I don't know, it just becomes, I level the playing field a bit of us being on the same level.
You wear your David Bowie shirt?
I actually haven't.
Or do you dress up to show that you're not a college student?
So sometimes I did that in the beginning, but now I just wear hoodies, if I'm being real with you. Yeah. I just wear hoodies, and I put my hair in a bun, and I just show up, and I'm like, hi. And it's actually kind of great.
How did you get in without a hoodie?
Oh my gosh. That describes so many Brooklyn parties. How did you get in without a hoodie?
Out of curiosity, did any of you ever Callie, this isn't for you, I guess. Have you ever been to a wedding, or was your own wedding crashed? Has it ever happened to you?
Have I ever crashed a wedding?
Or seen a wedding crashed? I'm saying this because we had somebody crash our wedding.
Really?
Yeah. It deals with a lot of this.
That
together.
feels like a high compliment, perhaps.
That my wedding was crashed.
That your wedding was worth crashing.
It was. Yeah. It kind of crashed. I'll tell the story.
Okay.
So my wife, my lovely Beth, she is such a joy, and I was so happy to get married to her. And she went out on a bachelorette party, and so she had this mix of girls she knew from high school and girls she knew from college. We got married. I was 25. She was 23. So, these were friends that we're still very close with. And she went into a hip neighborhood in Pittsburgh for her bachelorette party, and she's going out with her friends. Well, while she was out, she ran into one of her friends from high school who was on the border, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't invited.
But wasn't invited to the bachelorette party, right?
Oh.
So she was a friend, but not a bachelorette party friend. Well, she ended up just tagging along for the bachelorette party for the rest of the night.
Was she invited to the wedding?
No, she was not.
Oh, okay. So
right, and that's as much, again, Everybody knows you've got to make those calls. You wish you could invite, like the king said, and just grab everybody off the street and bring them in. She was not invited to the wedding. We show up, we're married, like pronounced you husband and wife, kiss the bride. We show up at the reception hall after the pictures, and the first person to greet us is this girl from the bachelorette party. Turns out one of her other high school friends we gave her a +1, thinking that she would bring a long-term boyfriend.
Yeah.
They had broken up, and she just invited this girl from the bachelorette party to come to the wedding.
So she didn't crash then.
She didn't officially crash, but it was like the first thing we saw walking in was the girl who was not invited and like jumping on and now it was fine.
Awkward.
It was
That's
fine.
awkward.
It was really awkward, incredibly awkward. And it was like, and we were like, well, you know what? It's one more, like clearly someone didn't show up. We're fine. Just be here. But like for a month afterwards, my wife was like, how did she get the gall to like just come? Like she wasn't like she gets a +1, and so it was a very odd situation in that way. Now, this person clearly had zero imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah.
But that sense of who belongs, who doesn't, and back to the parable here, that question of somebody sort of who's there who doesn't belong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'll be honest with you, like in that moment, Beth and I were like, what are you doing here? Like this is not the place for you. Like, I don't understand why you're here. I side a little bit with the king. I'm sympathetic with the king in the kicking out of the servant for that very reason.
Yeah.
I would only sympathize with the king if she like objected to, if anyone has any just cause for why these two should not be.
Oh yeah.
wedded.
Like if she like
if that was your scenario, rather than just there to have a good time and spend time with their friends.
Right.
So I would, yeah.
I think some of this question of imposter, feeling like an imposter, it really only shows up in environments where merit is the key element. At least that's my experience. So when we look at these environments where like you have to achieve at a certain level to like be there, that's where I think most of this question of feeling like an imposter comes from. That sense of like, I'm not good enough. I have fooled everybody here. If they only knew what was going on. And theoretically, right, a church should be a place where nobody feels like they're an imposter for being there. Like if you do church right, you've gotten rid of this idea of merit. You've gotten rid of this idea of like, you have to act a certain way to belong to be here.
Or it's a kind of anti-merit, where like, the only merit necessary is to believe and know that you need help.
And to show up.
Yeah.
Right. It's the anti-merit of showing up at AA.
Yeah, very much so.
In that,
the only thing that is required is your need of him.
Yeah.
To quote the old hymn. And so that sense of showing up and belonging and being here, it's a very low bar in that sense, which, did Judas suffer from imposter syndrome? Not information that we have really on hand to make a decision about.
Psychologize biblical figures.
Right. Let's not psychologize biblical figures.
It doesn't end very well.
But from that perspective, I mean, the grace is the thing that lowers imposter syndrome, and it makes you feel like you're actually welcome, because grace is that anti-merit. And so I think that's part of the joy of being a Christian, is you do have access to a God who actually you can't fool. God knows everything. He knows what's going on in your heart. He knows what's going on in your spirit. He knows what's going on in your life. And he hasn't kicked you out in that sense. And so I think that's the good news of this parable is for imposters, for those who feel like they're not good enough. I mean, everyone at this wedding, God just yanked off the side of the road while they were walking by. Right? The king just yanked them off the side of the road and welcomed them in. Like the bar here is on the ground to step over.
Nothing required of you.
You look like you're thinking, Todd. You got anything to add?
Well, I am thinking. I mean, because that solution is basic. What you just said is basically, I like Luke better than Matthew.
Yeah, it goes back to that. It does go back to that kingdom thing where you're like, well, this is more immediate than eternal in its context.
So then what would be your...
Well, I mean, I think if I were to try to make the wedding or to the wedding garment drama of this parable, if if I were to ask how is this good news, it would mostly be something to the effect that who Jesus is the it's the one decisive thing about who in the history of the world and as it relates to people, and how one responds to that is to God's generosity and benevolence and grace for the world is of significance. I mean, like, do you hate it or not? Right. Do you resent it? So I think it's associating with the man with Judas or with the Pharisees and scribes puts a point on the kind of like, this isn't ethics. This is, what do you believe about grace? What do you believe about who Jesus is? And it's meant to push back on who God is in the first place in that way.
I wonder what would have happened if the friend who was kicked out, if he had not been speechless, if he had said something. I don't know. Or is that just a silly question to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think if he had said something, he probably would have. Well, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're not going to go there. But that was just that was a question I had.
I mean, because you can say, well, if you were given a chance to speak, either A, he would be defensive for himself, or B, he would like spit in the king's face.
That's true.
It's like the parable of the talents, right? Where the guy calls, he's like, you're a hard master who reaps where he doesn't sow and takes what he does not produce, or
like
whatever.
That person had already decided who God was.
That's the spitting in the face in that passage, right?
Right.
You might expect something similar from this guy not in the right wedding clothes.
Gotcha.
Where it's like, well, if you want to know what's in his head, like, he doesn't like what's happening.
Yeah. So like Judas didn't feel remorse in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yes. So
he felt remorse later,
right?
But not then. Then he was intent that Jesus needed to go.
Yeah.
I mean, and so if we're gonna kind of impute a degree of like character background to this little tiny parable, that's about as much as one could say.
Yeah.
But I'm not willing to commit myself to
no.
Let's not psychologize.
That's a little speculative.
No.
Speculative.
Yeah.
It's a little speculative.
And I'm not entirely asking you to. I was just
it's
curious.
It's a thought experiment.
It's a thought.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to like, I don't think there's any scenario in which the guy says, "I am so sorry."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right. I was coming off of work and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
It's you're more likely to get a, how could you expect me to wear such clothing when I was coming from work?
Yeah.
Those are two different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the shift here is between, like, it's the shift here is between that sense of, is this a parable about people being good enough to get into the people of God, to get into the kingdom of God, right? That's what we said is the wrong way to think about it.
It's Matthew, Kingdom of Heaven.
King of Heaven, thank you.
Kingdom of Heaven, yes.
So that's the way we said that's not this parable. It's more about, how do you respond to Jesus' teachings?
Yeah.
Like, is this something that's compelling to you that you feel is worth exploring, loving, following, and putting in your own life? And kind of like, is Jesus good or bad?
And not the response of good works, but just like the basic response of, do
faith.
I want to accept this
Faith, yeah.
So
this truth of grace or not?
Back to Luther.
Mm-hmm.
How Luther summarizes this? It's going to be good.
Is it going to be a mic drop moment?
So this gospel is not difficult, and it is a terrible gospel because it speaks to them who despise the word of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on this one, Luther's got one right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ding ding.
Ding.
Thank you for listening to Terrible Parables. You can find us on the web at ember.com. Audio production for Terrible Parables is provided by TJ Hester. Please leave us a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you've had a not so terrible time.